Hey, um, I wanted to do a video and sort of talk about um, my story um, and about drug addiction, poly drug addiction, um, getting clean, you know, um, complex trauma, um, a lot of things that have uh, affected our society and the whole planet at this point. Um, and just sort of give my perspective on where I am and what I think the future holds and what I'd like the future to hold. um, you know a lot of people make these types of videos detailing their story, and these are the ones that have always sort of helped me when I was struggling with really bad active addiction. um, and I've never really made one. So here I am. This is my story of how drugs and substances have impacted my life, what I've done to try to mitigate the negative impacts, and to sort of give you a story of inspiration and hope, and also something real, so that you guys can understand that this is a lifelong thing. Um, from what I've seen in my personal experience and those I've talked to, it seems like a pretty complicated one. you know, I know in a lot of the support groups they talk about it being similar to diabetes and needing insulin and all of this, but I guess in some ways I am validating that experience. So this is sort of off the cuff. I didn't really prepare it. I just feel the way I do, and I felt like sharing. So I think that my story of substance use began probably when I was 15 years old, 15 or 16. I grew up in a really privileged suburb in the United States, and we were in one of the highest income suburbs in the United States at the time. And I had a pretty normal childhood, I would say. That is different for a lot of people. But I never wanted for anything in my life growing up. I was never insecure from a food perspective or a housing perspective. Well, we can get into that later. But yeah, like white, middle, upper class upbringing. However, there was some things that I think precipitated my drug use. One of those was a culture of drug use being normalized, and something that it was okay for young kids to do, especially in the area I grew up. There was a lot of people in my school that were getting high and smoking weed or taking pills. So there was access to it, right? And then secondly, I thought a lot about what drives people towards substance abuse and the cycle of addiction. And for me, it was dealing with some family drama, I think, more than anything, that made me have a sense of feeling like life wasn't that important, or that life was mostly bad. I felt very cynical um, when I started using drugs. My home life, I think that my parents had a very textbook codependent relationship where, my dad was an angry person. He was a very angry person. And he didn't really know how to contain that anger. And my mother was a very loving and supporting person, but also very bitter and negative person as well. And so those two combined, once I hit my teens, things sort of started falling apart. I was an only child, and so I never really had siblings to talk to sort of say, hey, this is like, what's going on? Like, how do we deal with this? I was really just in my own head, and at that time the internet had just come out. I was going on to websites and chat rooms and talking to people on different forums and things like this. So I felt that my siblings were more the internet and than the people at my school, because I didn't really relate to the people at my school. I think that there was a lot of classism and judgment based on the wealth of your family. And bear in mind, this was already a pretty well-off family that I was growing up in, and so it was a different level of judgment. It was a difference between, a millionaire versus multimillionaire versus, filthy rich is kind of the dynamic I can describe it as. So yeah, I didn't really connect with the people that I was surrounded by. And the ones that I did surround myself with ended up being those from not broken homes, but homes where there was something off, right? Lack of community, a lack of understanding of what a healthy family looks like, maybe. And maybe that doesn't exist. Maybe all families are broken in their own way. And but I think me and the friends I used to use with were from families that were broken in a way enough to the point where they felt a need to escape. So anyway, it's a little bit about the background. So yeah, I think my parents used to fight all the time. And, they would get into really bad fights. They would scream at each other, say they were going to kill one another, threaten to do really bad things to each other. The police got called many times when I was growing up. And, with some perspective and meeting people from different backgrounds, this is like, it wasn't much compared to what other people go through. I know that, right? Not to minimize my own suffering, but I did feel helpless. I felt helpless in the moment. And that sucked. I felt like I didn't have anybody to go to, and when I did explain my situation, people said like, well, your parents need to get a divorce. And that just never happened, because I think they came from a religious background where, sorry, I'm getting a text here. Anyway, yeah, my parents came from a religious background where you don't give up on marriage, you don't split up. And, I know that people who are from homes that separated, struggle in their own way. But staying is its own kind of difficulty as well. It's not to say that, it's not just staying together or having a father or having a mother around is the answer. You need healthy caregivers, right? And yeah, I think around the time of the great financial crisis in 2008 was when our family really started to fall apart in terms of healthy living. And, I know that was a tremendous amount of stress on my parents, trying to maintain the house that we were living in, because we were living in, you know, one of those McMansion type deals, and a lot of people were, you know, struggling at that time. And so I met up with a friend, and you know, I think it was my idea to purchase marijuana the first time. And I went to my friends and I said, hey, let's do this. And you know, I had a friend group of 3 people, and one was sort of like the guy who watched everybody get super high and do stupid stuff and laugh at it. And he never really did stuff himself. You know, he would drink a beer once in a while, but nothing crazy. And then me and this other friend, just call him Jack, we really got into it. You know, I think his parents were going through a divorce, and you know, we were both in homes that felt kind of broken at the time. So, you know, we smoked marijuana for a while, and that was, you know, just kids having fun. And I think that it allowed me to view things from a different perspective that drew me to it. It was a feeling where I was able to analyze things in my life in ways that I hadn't before, and that sort of intrigued me, right? It was like I felt so trapped in who I was and what I wanted to become, and I felt like my life was perfectly laid out in front of me. And you know, I had my parents telling me to go to college and, you know, study business and you know, then get a good job and start a family and all these things, you know. And it felt really predetermined. And from watching what my parents had, it really made me question, like, if what you guys have is the end of me putting in effort for the next 20 years, why do it? Because clearly there's no happiness around, right? And I think that was one of the things that made me not care about using substances or what they did to my body or my mind or how they were going to impact my life. I was like, screw this. I don't want to go down this path. Like, if I act like a bunch of squares like you guys did, I'm just going to end up in the same shitty marriage that you guys have. So, like, fuck the normal life, you know? And so, yeah, I was smoking a lot of marijuana, and at this point, Jack had stolen some painkillers from his mother. So his mother was a opioid addict, I suppose. You know, she had chronic pain, a lot of back pain, nerve pain, this kind of thing. And I think this is where things really started to take off, you know, is after feeling how the marijuana made me feel, I was like, hey, why not? Let's try something else. And so, you know, we had some Vicodins, I think they were called back then. And, you know, he had a big bottle of those, and we started taking them. And it made me feel something. It made me feel like I didn't have to deal with the problems that I was going through at home. You know, I would finish school and I would go over to my friend's house, and we would just do drugs, and I would forget everything that was happening in my life, and it felt really good. And, you know, I started with the Vicodin, and yeah, I think he was working as like a veterinarian assistant at this point, and he had access to different kinds of medications, you know. I mean, there was like pure morphine pills. This was before fentanyl hit the scene, you know, but we were taking pure morphine in high doses, and then, you know, we started buying Ritalin and Adderall, and you know, doing that stuff, and drinking the alcohol as well. And so at this point, already at 16, 17, I was pretty heavy poly drug user, you know, like stuff that would really fucking make your head spin, man. Like, and that's what I mean by the access is we were in such an affluent neighborhood. It's not like we were, you know, jumping straight into doing the harder stuff, which I eventually got around to, but the more expensive soccer mom drugs, as we used to call them, the soccer mom drugs. And we used to do, combine that shit. And I don't know if my parents knew if I was like doing this stuff. I would come home at 3 in the morning and, in my car, and I feel so bad. I was driving around while doing all this stuff, but anyway, yeah, so, that period happened, and then I went off to university, I made it through high school and got into a good liberal arts school. And there, I didn't really deal with drug addiction for a while, or at least I didn't think I was. Alcohol was so prevalent there and so normalized. Like, heavy binge drinking was so normalized that I never even considered, alcoholism or, drug addiction, because it was just such a pervasive activity. Drinking until you're, blackout drunk on a Tuesday. It was just normal. It was normal. I think like most of the school was alcoholic, at least the people that I hung out with, right? And I started smoking cigarettes then too, in college. It was the tobacco capital of the world where I went to school. So, there's a lot of tobacco and nicotine, and I started doing all that stuff. And yeah, I think I was drinking a lot, but I think I had my first girlfriend when I was a freshman in college, and she got raped at school by this really bad senior. She went to a party and ended up drinking a lot, and I think that people were making her drink more than she wanted to, and she got sexually taken advantage of, and that guy ended up getting kicked out of the school, and the police were involved. But it was a big it was one of the first like moments in my life where I just felt really deep rage and anger and sadness. I'd felt that stuff growing up, but not in this way, not in realizing that there was more people in the world that could hurt me. I knew that like my parents had, caused some damage, but when I saw that there were people out there that would just do really bad things and not feel bad about it, that really made me more depressed and cynical. So I started drinking really heavy, to the point where even my classmates were like, "Man, you got a problem." You got a problem. And I think that was my roommate introduced me to Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the first time that I was ever introduced to this concept of recovery, right? And I didn't really think much of it. We went to a meeting or two at the time, and I didn't really think much of it. I didn't really think I had a problem. And I quit doing the alcohol, and so I kind of felt better. But then I started getting really heavy into stimulants. I've been diagnosed with ADHD, and I really believe I've got pretty intense ADHD. My life has been okay with it. I've managed to adapt. But I started, self-medicating a little bit with Adderall and Ritalin, and started to realize that like when I took this medicine, I was able to find school interesting. It was the first time that I opened a textbook and was like, wow, this is actually something I'm like, I want to learn about this stuff, and it made me feel like I could be smart and I could get good grades and do my homework and stuff. The problem was that I already had a history of drug abuse at this point, and so taking more it was an easy step, so I was taking handfuls of the Adderalls and this kind of thing, and eventually got a doctor and was able to get a prescription and take it as prescribed for a while, but it stopped doing what it was doing at the beginning, the way that it made me feel excited about life, you know. And maybe at that point I was just depressed, and it was working as an antidepressant. I don't know. I mean, maybe that for you guys, maybe you can relate to that. Maybe I was just making myself not depressed. But yeah, I ended up really going down a path of heavy medication abuse to the point where I ended up dropping out of school. You know, I had 1 year left, and the thing with my girlfriend happened, and I really just went down a bad path. You know, at this point, I was doing things that I didn't know that I could do. You know, I was stealing money from roommates. I was, you know, talking to the RA to get keys to open up my neighbors' doors so that I could steal from them and like sell stuff to get money to buy more pills, you know. And yeah, that was when I really started to like think of myself as a bad person, I guess. So yeah, I came home from school, and I moved back in with my parents, and you know, they were supportive, but I think that at that point I was really blaming them a lot for what I was doing. I got a job at a grocery store, and my addiction just never stopped. You know, I would get maybe 10 days, 15 days sober or something like that, but you know, at the grocery store, I was at like a Kroger, and I was stealing like these giant jugs of wine, and every night before bed, I was just chugging as much as I could to fall asleep. And, you know, I really felt like a failure. I think that was the root of it, is I felt like I failed, you know. I thought I was gonna marry my girlfriend at the time and start a family. Thank God we didn't, you know. I thought that I was going to be like a successful computer scientist or economist or whatever, and it didn't happen. And now I was just a dropout working at a grocery store, you know. And you know, I don't think that society realizes how much damage all this stuff does. Like, well, they do, they see it, but like it affects everybody, man, you know. It's not like drug addicts are bad people. It's just like drugs make you forget about shit that's going on, and we live in such a crazy world that like it's hard not to try to find a way to shut your brain off, you know. And the education system, I don't know if it's improved, but it for me it was you were treated with shame, and you were treated with like, why don't you know how to make good choices? You know, it wasn't viewed as something to be helped. It was like, stop being a bad person, you have such a good life, kind of a thing, you know. I would say that my mental illness also started getting really bad at that time. I was quite suicidal. I think I was very borderline at that point in my life. Self-harm, cutting, you know, suicidal ideation, driving recklessly. Man, I really endangered some people the way I was driving. I was doing 100, you know, after drinking a bottle of wine in the car, you know. Not good stuff, not good stuff. And I never got in trouble. I never got pulled over or anything, you know. Never had a criminal record. And, you know, on one hand, I'm really happy about that. On the other hand, I feel guilty that, you know, but that whole system's fucked up anyway, right? There's no social help. It's just all profit motives to, you know, try to nickel and dime people at every point of their suffering on this journey. You know, that's one thing I really dislike about how drug addiction is treated in society. But anyway, so yeah, I was really in a really bad point in my life there. And at that point, my parents said, like, you've got to move out. I was breaking property. I was, getting into fist fights. I was really just being a fucking nuisance at that point, and I didn't know what to do with my life. I didn't know if I should go back to school or try to find a job or what. But I ended up contacting a roommate from university, and he drove down to the state that I was living in, and we started living together. And things were good for a while, but they eventually broke down. He was an addict like me, and we were being alcoholic together and abusing stimulants together, and we ended up getting a pretty decent job with our college experience, and I started doing some programming and falling in love with computer science a little bit, but at that point my life was still dominated by drug use. I don't think I went a single day sober through most of that part of my life either. I was taking medicine prescribed by a doctor, but in a way I just felt high all the time, and I liked that. I didn't want to be slowed down. I didn't want to be in second gear. I wanted to be fucking zooted. And so that's what I did, and I heard a lot of people in relationships at that point in my life too. I had no sense of self control, and I had no sense of accountability, because my father treated my mom really bad, and I knew that the way that I was treating women was bad, but I didn't really know how to stop it. I didn't think I could stop it, but I would get into these like moments of rage, like screaming, shouting, throwing things, punching walls, breaking windows, like this kind of just wilding out, man. And I was always with women that had men like that in their lives, either dads or whatever, but they always found it acceptable. And I don't know how we found each other. People always think like, you're a predator, like a monster, and you're finding people that you can prey on and stuff, but it's not like that, man. And a lot of the like women's movement and stuff, I agree that guys need to get better, that like the patriarchy's normalizing this behavior, but the mentality at that time, especially during the Me Too movement, right? The mentality of that time in American history was like, those people are monsters and they don't deserve a happy life. They're evil people, if they emotionally abuse someone or physically or verbally abuse someone, they don't deserve a second chance. And so a lot of that stuck with me. And it wasn't my choice, my actions were my choice, but I was just repeating the behaviors that I saw growing up, and I was treated like a monster that should die. And I'm not, today I accept who I am and accept responsibility for my behavior. But if looking back on that period, like as a society, we went too far in saying to women, especially, like, those guys are monsters and they can never heal, and they're narcissists, and they're, there's so much Netflix stuff going on with like, and it was good. It was like this patriarchal movement, but there was nothing for the men. There was nothing for the men. And so you were put in a situation where you had to lie to yourself and then lie to the other person about who you were. So I would, get into a relationship and act like the best guy that I could, because I genuinely wanted to be a good guy. And then the mask would start to slip and some of those behaviors would come out. And at this point, like in society, people were attuned to all this mental health stuff, and they'd go like, oh, he's a narcissistic abuser and he's a monster, so cut him out of your life completely, ghost him, and don't get yourself involved. And that happened 2 or 3 times to me, and I really started to think like, I'm a fucking monster, man. I don't deserve to be happy with anybody. And that, I think, was a turning point when I really said to myself, like, I am a monster. And couldn't really talk to my parents about it. Because, like, I don't know if they ever really understood what I was going through, or I don't know. It just, our communication broke down so heavily that I was so pissed at them for this stuff that I witnessed growing up, and that they never got divorced, and they were so pissed at me for acting like such an insane person. And my dad was like paying for my college, and got a car and all this stuff, and so I really did damage in their direction as well. So there was damage on both sides. And so at that point, my parents moved out of the country. I think this was 2016-ish, and financially it was becoming a more difficult scenario, and Trump had just been elected for the first time, and things were in a weird spot from a society standpoint. So they moved out of the country, and they moved to a different country. They had the financial resources to do that, and they did. And I decided to stay in the States. And at this point, I felt really abandoned by society. I felt abandoned by my family. I felt abandoned by the community. I felt abandoned by the people that said that they loved me in my life. They were always just like, damn, this guy can never get his shit together. I can't be around him. And then I just kept telling myself, I can't ever get my shit together. I'm just a broken person, right? And so at this point, I started talking to this girl, and my parents had left the country, and I had just broken up with my girlfriend, and I knew that this girl was into hard drugs. And I think at that point, I was ready to die, right? I was ready to figure out a way to kill myself, And people don't get into meth and heroin when things are going great, So yeah, I was ready to die. Wow, saying that out loud is it's heavy, man. Because I really didn't care. Yeah. So anyway, I contacted this girl, and I knew she was into meth and other stuff. And I was at an apartment that time, and my mom was sending me checks to pay the rent. I think she felt super guilty for sort of leaving the country and in the state that I was in, but I really wasn't at a point where I knew how to fix myself. So yeah, I started doing meth, smoking meth from a pipe, and that quickly consumed my life. If you haven't done it, you really don't know how fast it takes over your life. It's days. Whew, and you just become so crazy. And I started injecting it, right? And I don't think I would have injected it, but the problem with hard drugs is that once you start using them, you become so out of your mind that you really stop paying attention to what's happening. So my roommate started using needles, and I was doing it with her, and she was really far gone. I was shooting her up in the neck and trying to hit her feet, and not good stuff, and it scared me, but at this point I was ready to die, so I didn't really care. And so yeah, I became a very heavy meth user, and my life became hitting up the dealer that I had, and I think that was one of the darkest points in my life. The people that entered my life at that point were some of the scariest I've ever had in my life. You know, I had people over to my apartment because I was so lonely, man. I didn't have friends, I didn't have a job, I didn't have family. I basically cut my parents off, and I just had a bunch of drug dealers and meth cooks and like really bad people in my house, man. And yeah, it got bad. And there was a point where, you know, we owed money to these dealers, and I remember being in the living room, and you know, two guys showed up to my apartment, and they put a bag over my roommate's head, like this brown bag, and you know, took her out of the apartment, and she was just gone for fucking like 8 hours or something. And then she came back, and I was like asking what happened, and like she wouldn't tell me. And I don't know, man. I don't know if like something sexual happened or physical or what, but like it was really bad. And at that point, like I realized like I gotta stop living like this, you know. And I told my roommate, like, you got to move out of the apartment, you know. But, you know, she would have been homeless if that would have happened. So I sort of enabled that behavior. And, like, at this point, she started dating this guy. And he was just, like, living in the apartment with us. It was insane. We had, like, 7, 8 people just fucking doing drugs. It just became a trap house, bro. It was really bad. And what's crazy is that, like, apartment complex never fucking said shit. Like, we were being so loud, I don't know how we didn't get like evicted or something. I guess we were just paying the rent and nobody cared. And it was like in the Arlington area, like you know, funky town. Like people knew what was up back then, you know. And yeah, I mean, we started doing like 8 balls, like shooting meth and heroin at the same time and this kind of thing. And then I started getting really scared for my life, you know. I wanted to die really bad, but at the same time, I thought that there could be a new way of living my life. And yeah, I think I contacted my parents and I said, like, I need help, man. I don't know what to do. And they said, like, are you ready to stop doing drugs? And I said, yeah, I think so. Yeah. So my dad came down, and, you know, I had sort of sold everything. I was selling my fucking kitchen table for meth at that point. So there wasn't much in the apartment. But we had trashed the place. And I left, and I went to a Pine Street Rehab Center, you know, and that was my first rehab. It was just like a 28-day, 30-day thing. And I don't remember much of it because I was detoxing off some heavy shit, man. I was sort of just fucking out of it for a while. And I remember meeting some good people and some terrible people. And like even through the addiction lens, like I was able to see that which people didn't want to be in that situation and really wanted to change, and then the people that seemed like actually evil, you know. And I don't like to use that word, but they seemed like they didn't care the harm that they were doing. And maybe you get there if you stay in this world too long, but you know, I really remember some of the people that I were around, you know, people who had killed other people, people who had you know, really ruined a lot of people's lives by dealing drugs or, you know, creating drugs or whatever. But anyway, yeah. So I went to the rehab, and then they dump you out of that rehab pretty fast. And they do a good job teaching you in there, like what you need to do with your life. But they don't really give you much resources after that. And these drugs are so addictive that if you are anywhere near them again after 30 days, my God, you cannot keep yourself from doing it again. I mean, unless you like really, really, really have something else inside of you and don't want to do it. So yeah, I left rehab, and that same afternoon, I went and met my roommate, and we were smoking meth that night, And I was up 2 or 3 days straight because I hadn't done it in so long, and I really went crazy, man. I really started hallucinating bad. I think like with people overdose with heroin and things like that when they leave rehab, but with meth, like I think you can do a lot of it without dying. And so I did like a regular amount, but whoa. And I started getting really paranoid, seeing helicopters in the sky, thinking that the TV was talking to me, thinking that at one point I was like 20 feet up in a tree, like hiding from police that weren't there. And, I kept hearing these like police on motorcycles, and it was pitch black, and I was just afraid to come down. And I don't know, I don't remember much, but I ended up waking up in a hospital. Last thing I remember was a guy in a hospital jamming my ass with a needle with some kind of tranquilizer, knocking me out. And I was in this room with like gymnastics like pads on the floor, and they calmed me down or knocked me out, and I woke up on like the 10th floor of this mental institution. And I remember looking out, and it was just a sea of people like me, man. Like hundreds. Excuse me. I just looked, and I was like, Jesus, this is an epidemic. And it was. I didn't know like the extent of it at the time, but it was just filled with people, man. And there was this animosity, and I don't want to be like racial about it, but like all the nurses were like African American, and it was a bunch of like rich white boys because of the neighborhood we were in, and they had this like hatred for us, and like rightly so, because like they were like, yeah, I'm glad the white man's fucking suffering from this shit, and that didn't feel great, but I understand it. There are also some nice people, There are also some nice people. But yeah, so, I was hospitalized at that point, and, I was with a lot of, like, teenagers that wanted to, kill themselves or whatever, And I remember, like, realizing, like, society was kind of breaking apart. At least it felt that way, It really felt like something in the world was breaking apart, Just with the number of people I personally knew going through the same shit, and the ones who like were able to stay out of it, I don't know, their lives just put them in a place where it was never an option, or they saw the destruction it was doing, or they just listened to their teachers and their parents, and never had a reason to get out of themselves. And I'm jealous of that. I'm jealous of the people that didn't need a reason to nod off, man. Yeah. But yeah, it just felt like society was getting too complex to live. But anyway, I got discharged from that place, and at this point I contacted my family and said, like, hey, I think I'm gonna leave the States. And they were happy about that. And I was too, because it felt like a fresh start, I don't think I would be alive if I didn't leave that area I was in. I think like the fentanyl would have hit there, and I would have been done, man. Yeah. I mean, saying that it's hard because like fentanyl was just hitting the scene when I got out, because I remember like my roommate shooting it up, and like I didn't touch it because I knew that people were dying from such small doses, you know. We were doing the black tar heroin, you know, and you know, smoking that off of foil and shooting that up. But I never touched the fent, man. I never touched it. Thank God. But yeah, I mean, I smoked meth the night before I got on my flight to move out of the country. And I left with like one suitcase and some clothes. And I like came to a different country. And I think something changed there, you know? That was the first time that I really knew that I had to live differently, you know? I was drinking heavily. I was alcoholic, but I didn't, I never touched the hard stuff again. I wouldn't allow myself. It just destroyed my life so fast. And it brought me to oblivion so fast that I couldn't do it. And, you know, I had opportunities, but I just wouldn't let myself get near it. And I thought that the alcohol was the lesser of two evils, you know. I still had no direction in my life at this point, you know. And I was drinking really heavy. I think at my worst, I was drinking a whole handle of rum every single night, or whiskey every single night, you know. And I ended up in the hospital with a bleeding ulcer, you know, Barrett's esophagus syndrome, and I was throwing up every single night. I was drinking so much I would throw up, and I was so out of it that I would, you know, forget I threw up and kept drinking and passed out. And, you know, my landlord was like asking me what's happening, because I was like screaming in my sleep and like throwing shit in my sleep, and I didn't even realize what I was doing, man. I didn't even realize that I was fucking throwing bottles out of windows and, you know, just shouting in this stupor, you know. And yeah, after the hospital visit for the ulcers, I realized like I don't want to deal with this medical shit of the alcohol. So I really started getting into the for the 12-step programs, you know, the Alcoholics Anonymous and the Narcotics Anonymous, and I put myself into it, and I really got clean. You know, I got clean off of everything, off of alcohol, cigarettes, coffee, fucking dead, fucking sober like my dad died, man, like sober for close to 2 years. But my life was pretty small at that point, you know. I had my parents, and I had myself, and I had meetings, and that was my life. And so after the 2 years, I felt like I was really getting on my feet again, you know. I was doing some work and making some money, and, you know, things were going good. So at that point, I really thought that I didn't ever want to be in a relationship again, because like I was this monster and I couldn't be loved, right? But after the 2 years, I really started doing some healing, and I met somebody, and, you know, we really started loving each other, and she's my wife now. And she's pregnant. She's 8 months pregnant now, and we're about to have a son. And it's really exciting, you know. So life does get better, man. But that's not to say that like everything's fine. Like that's what I mean when at the beginning of this video when I said like it's something that impacts you your whole life. Because, you know, I ended up in a point where, you know, after our wedding and everything, you know, I went to a doctor. I was having some bad anxiety problems, and I started taking benzodiazepines, clonazepam, right? And, you know, at the top, I was taking 3-4 milligrams of that a day, and, you know, I'm down to 1 milligram, stabilized on 1 milligram. But again, I just feel like I think back to everything I've gone through in my life, and I'm like, why the hell did I put myself through it, you know? And the answer is that some of the trauma that like I've gone through, and probably you guys have gone through too, is you just feel in so much pain. You're like, I just need the pain to stop. I just need the pain to stop from normal life. Because like the way I used to live was not the way that humans in society, civilized society, interact, you know? Like, I go from like zombie land, homeless shelter, like anything to fucking, you know, get a hit, and then to like a software engineer making, you know, 90K and like on top of the world. And that's such a dramatic shift when you get back on that like path of, you know, regular guy, regular life, that it's hard to adjust. A lot of things people don't understand. Like, my teeth are fucked up, man. Like, I got no, you can't even see my teeth when I talk. You see it? Like that. I just destroyed my mouth doing meth, man. And like, yeah, it's hard to deal with the two identities of like, am I this guy who did unspeakable stuff, or am I this guy who like got his shit together and is gonna be a great dad and all that, you know? And yeah, it's tough to deal with that change. So yeah, I mean, right now, like, still taking the pills. Like, I'm taking antidepressants, and I'm taking the Ritalin for the ADD, and I'm taking this stuff for the anxiety, and trying to quit the cigarettes and the smoking, and but it all feels really, really hard to get back to that place, you know? It's like I was able to stay clean for 2 years when I had nothing in my life. When I was just going to meetings and like that was it, right? But once you start slowly adding stuff to your life, it gets tough. And you start to think about the old ways you used to deal with stuff. Like, you know, going out and picking up and doing stuff. And, you know, my wife understands some of it. I don't think she really understands all of addiction, and I don't think anybody can unless you've gone through it, you know? But, you know, she's an amazing support, you know, and she's finally someone that understands who I am, you know, and doesn't just label me like drug addict or, you know, guy with mental problems or whatever. Like, you know, she's fucking there for me. So yeah. You know, and we're entering a new chapter in our lives, you know. My son's gonna be born, and everything's gonna be different. And I'm getting anxious just thinking about it, but I don't want to use again. I don't want to be a dad that uses. And yeah, feel something saying that one too, right? You know, I'm gonna be a daddy, man. That's a lot of responsibility with that. You can't screw that up. I think that's being a good husband and being a good father. There's a lot of motivation that comes with that. I'm not saying have kids and get married if your life's like fucked up, but like once you get to that point, like, it puts things in perspective, you know. And in a lot of ways, it makes me feel bad that, like, I don't know. I'm not a parent yet, but like, I don't know how my parents acted the way they did having a kid. Like, I don't want to act like that, man. Like, no kid should go through seeing that shit. No kid should go through that, man. Like, I don't want to do that to my son. But yeah, if you're in the middle of it, you got a whole story going, you know. And in rehabs and everything else, people always say, like, anybody can turn it around. And maybe that's true. Because I think all it takes is making the decision that you're going to do something different with your life. You have to have that belief that you're a good person deep down, you know? And if you're able to love yourself, then the rest is possible. But yeah, don't get too hung up on like the 12-step meetings. And at the end of the day, that stuff's kind of a cult, right? And it's a cult that like leads down this like evangelical Christian pipeline, which is kind of screwed up, especially the way society is right now. Like, your answer is not the Bible, bro. Like, you're just what does it say in the basic text? Like, we changed whiskey for beer. Like, don't go changing beer for the Bible, man. Like, that's not, you don't need that either. That's just another way of not thinking, in my opinion. You know, I'm spiritual. I read the Bible and pray and stuff, but I don't think it's right to be getting high on that all day either. You gotta live your life. But yeah, you know, I know the world's really hard right now, but don't make a bad situation worse, as they say. I hope that you got something out of this. Trying to share my experience, strengths, and hope, and you know, I think I'm gonna try to get sober again completely, not take any medications, and keep fighting the good fight and being a good person. And it's real easy not to be a good person right now. So put the work in. I hope you can be one of the good ones in this crazy fucking world we're living in. We gotta raise the next generation, and we gotta put some better values into our kids, you know? Anyway, till next time.